Frieren, Beyond Journey's End, is an anime manga series that should have won 2024's Anime of the Year. The series is about an elf mage named Frieren, who, following the death of one of her companions, realizes she has kept herself from making deeper emotional connections and seeks to truly take time to understand humanity. Along the way, she and her new companions take some side quests, including the defeat of some high-level demons.
Demons are beasts who seek to devour.
As this is a fantasy series, there are different races of creatures: human, elves, dwarves, demons, etc. In this world, demons are a race of powerful magic users who are essentially predator animals that have mastered human speech and have enough knowledge of human emotions to manipulate them. The series makes it clear that while demons can feel emotions, they are individualistic creatures who operate on a power-based hierarchy. Their ability to manipulate humans despite this is based around the fact that their morality is not compatible at all with humanity, but they look and can act human enough to deceive them.
Why would you call out to a mother you've never known?
It's simple. That word stops humans. It keeps them from murdering us. Isn't that magical?
Despite this explanation, there is a discourse of the series that insists that there is something deeper going on with the demons, that they are in some way an allegory for something. I've seen the something range from racial discrimination to ableism because of their inability to understand human morality is transformed to have something to do with autism, which to me sounds a little problematic, but I didn't come up with that theory. Whoever thinks that can explain so in the comments. This conversation, however, felt like a really great starting point to discuss one of the tropes that really frustrates me from time to time: fantastical racism.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
Fantastical, with fantastical meaning fantasy, is when a prejudice against non-human groups serves a purpose of being an examination of real-world bigotry or discrimination.
Try not to blame them for their ignorance.
Don't defend them. My mother cast me out like I was some kind of deviant.
Either as an expansion of existing prejudice or putting a mirror to audiences to explore their own biases in fiction.
Then why not stay in disguise all the time? You know, look like everyone else.
Because we shouldn't have to.
This has been used across a number of works of sci-fi and fantasy in novels, comics, and television shows. On a surface level, this makes a lot of sense. There are figures and creatures in mythology based on racism and stereotypes. Even some not originally rooted in those stereotypes can, due to how some of those elements have been blended together, end up transforming the original thing into more of a stereotype. Because of this, people have been primed to look at a character or choice like demons that are very clearly aligned, morally corrupt as a race, and rather than accepting this as piece of world building, that instead this has to be something that is meant to be interrogated deeper. Mind you, as I am explaining this, I am not one of those the curtains is just blue people. Other situations where that comes up, sure. I think that sometimes it's fun to interview authors and have them like, what inspired you to do that? And it was honestly kind of a very arbitrary decision. My issue with the fantastical racism trope is not that we can't go deeper. It is that sometimes because of the way that those tropes are constructed and how fantastical racism is used in narrative, it ends up kind of priming the audience to believe that certain things are indicative of racial dynamics.
You watched Battlestar, right?
Yeah, I love when they do terrorism allegory with mostly white people.
So race is, let's say it together, a social construct, which means that it doesn't exist inherently. We as human beings are all part of the same race. Race throughout history has been used to mean different things. In earlier times, it was used to talk about divine heritage of certain families to justify their right to rule, their racial superiority, like the Targaryens, use a fictional example. As slavery and colonialism took root, there needed to be a biological reason to justify white supremacy, and that is how we got race science to operate on a grand scale. There have always been caste systems, however, conflicts between indigenous groups and imperial powers, but the way we think about it now, race, is based upon this desire to break down humanity into a racial hierarchy that had Western white people at the top of that system. However, the idea of whiteness is very multifaceted, because while we do have whiteness as a broad construct, especially in America, that is operating in a different space of whiteness than in Europe. I just want to make sure that caveat's very clear, because people will tell me like, what about this and that? And I'm like, listen, I get it. You Irish person are not the same as English person. Totally understand. We're just gonna disclaimer, so you don't have to write it out to me. And because wherever you go globally, there will be different narratives. Oppression looks different all across the globe. And I know everyone hates the 10,000 caveats at the beginning of a video essay, but then I get told that I don't know what an Irish traveler is. The Heathcliff discourse has really rotted my soul. Finally, I have to put on my big academic cap because I don't really enjoy talking about philosophy like that. Wrong channel, there are plenty of alternatives. The root of fantastical racism as a tool of storytelling can be traced back to the exploration of the other. In philosophy, there is the concept of the self, that is you. And for the purposes of this video, it is also going to be Midoriya from My Hero Academia. George Heigl explained in the 18th century that in order to define the self, you need an other to be the counterpart, who in this conversation will be Bakugo. This is not an endorsement of Bakudeku. I am a Kiri Baku shipper because my ex told me to be. Manifestations of the other in Western cultural studies is race science, Orientalism, and this placement in the West as being the default of the self and the other being something strange, primitive, dangerous, and ill-formed. It can manifest in different ways for any culture that you're talking about. It leads to things like diaspora wars, anti-native sentiments across multiple cultures, and even within queerness, the other is a difference or difference that makes people uncomfortable and creates cultural instabilities. And those perceived instabilities are used in fantastical racism to explore that discomfort through allegory, themes, and writing that signals to the reader to connect this situation in the story to real life. And I'm just realizing now that even My Hero Academia is technically also that, because, you know, Deku is the one who starts off quirkless and he's being bullied. So really, I mean, are you the self and then you're the other? But you're the protagonist. I'm putting these back. Here's just a Shoto. Here's just a Todoroki for culture. Based on the Southern Vampire Mysteries, the HBO show True Blood by Alan Ball was a massive hit as a horror fantasy drama on that network from 2008 to 2014. The show is about a telepathic waitress, Sookie Stackhouse, who ends up being part of several vampire and supernatural conflicts after dating Bill Confederacy Compton.
Did you own slaves?
Tara?
The premise of the franchise was that the supernatural always existed, but vampires came out of the coffin and recently gained their own civil rights as a group and continuing to work towards that.
We pay taxes. We deserve basic civil rights just like everyone else.
Yeah, but, I mean, come on, doesn't your race have a rather sordid history of exploiting and feeding off innocent people?
Alan Ball, who himself is gay, took the monsters as other concept that existed in the books and in just folklore discourse and expanded it in the show with more openly LGBTQ characters and having much bigger conversations about discrimination, addiction, faith, using vampires and other monsters as stand-ins.
We never should have given them the vote and legitimized their unholy existence. The American people need to know these are creatures of Satan.
Now, using vampires or monsters as an examination of otherness is not new. That is the original purpose of the monster in fiction. Problems do arise with this kind of storytelling at certain points because we do have to acknowledge the fact that vampires do drink human blood. And also, the root of a lot of vampire, witch, and werewolf stories is rooted in, like, racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, you know, Islamophobia. Like, these monsters are really as the other. We have reclaimed them and we intellectualize them, and that gives them a new life. But in a lot of cases, their original space is to be villainous examinations of what the self, in this case the West, views. For example, with Dracula. Like, he is a clearly coded Eastern European kind of queer guy, and he's not the protagonist. He may be the titular character, but he is not the protagonist of that story. And a lot of his characterization is rooted in anti-Semitic and, you know, xenophobic ideas that now when we analyze it and we view it through a queer lens or through a racial lens, we can bring depth out of it and we can use it as a tool of storytelling. And what happens very clumsily in these sort of stories where they explicitly tie the realities of LGBTQ plus and minority rights to monsters is that the monsters end up overwhelmingly being white.
Because you know they can hypnotize you.
Yeah, black people are lazy and Jews have horns.
So what we end up having are these white allegorical creatures abusing and harming actual marginalized people. As I mentioned in my Confederate vampire video, which has reached 1 million views, and I have to say I'm just so humbled by that. I still can't believe it. Like, not that's the two things that I forgot to talk about while I was gone. We reached 300,000 over 300,000 subscribers, and that video got 1 million views. Like, that is the video that made me decide to do this full time. And yeah, we're gonna have a celebration about that later, I promise. But as I mentioned in my Confederate vampire video, Tara is often made to feel as if she's a bigot for being anti-vampire and ends up being treated as racially aggressive. She ends up being one of the only reoccurring black vampires in the series, and she is turned after dying to save Sookie.
I fucked up.
Lafayette, don't!
I turned her into the thing she hate most.
We didn't have a choice. She was dead.
And I should have left her dead, Sook.
There's only one other major black vampire that we get in the series. And he, you know, he certainly is black, but that's really all he is. And he is a vampire who gets killed by the Confederate vampire. I wonder how Bill felt in that moment. Was it nostalgic for him? It is in moments like this that the allegory falls apart. Rather than being an examination of otherness, the otherness then becomes a shield for broader conversations about how actual marginalized characters are treated. It understands and can present the politics in the form of bodies and faces audiences in general can relate to. But that only ends up reinforcing the self. And the biggest issue that ends up emerging whenever we get worlds like this, which uses the stories of marginalized people as a way of telling fantastical stories, is that we eventually get to a point where it circles around to almost validate the suspicious nature of bigots because, you know, now you can shoot lasers out of your eyes. X-Men is the most important piece of modern fantastical racism allegory that's been written. While this series was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the importance and longevity of the brand is absolutely due to the work of Chris Claremont. When he came to the property, it had, you know, been kind of a flop. It had been canceled, and he really cultivated it and co-created many of the characters that have become favorites today. It is also because of him that there's so much emphasis on bigotry in the work. The X-Men are hated, feared, and despised collectively by humanity for no other reason than that they were mutants. So what we have here, intended or not, is a book that is about racism, bigotry, and prejudice. The series has discussed genocide, anti-Semitism, religion, queerness, all kinds of political ideology, and racism of all stripes. It is that bitch. The existence of Magneto is one of the best things and most complex things that ever happened to X-Men because of the discussions it has about politics. You know, I'm a big Magneto was right person, and I do mean that should have sarcastically. It's more that Scott Summers was right, but we won't get into that today. And I think what makes Magneto effective and also probably one of the more interesting X-Men characters is that he is canonically a Jewish Holocaust survivor. Because comic writers have retconned his name and ethnicity several times, he is sometimes written as having been Romani or having been married to a Romani woman, but again, comic lore changes all the time. But the consistent thing about him is that he is Jewish and a victim and survivor of the Holocaust, and that really colors his perspective in the struggle for mutant rights.
What would you have me do, Charles? I've heard these arguments before. It was a long time ago. Mankind has evolved since then.
Yes, into us.
From Magneto's perspective, if people already don't accept other people as equals, what hope is there that they will accept mutants? And why should mutants who have these powers be made to feel inferior to this group of people who are so bigoted. I just want to say, as someone who has, and this was given to me by my late friend,
And there are even rumors, Miss Gray, of mutants so powerful that they can enter our minds and control our thoughts, taking away our God-given free will. I think the American people deserve the right to decide whether they want their children to be in school with mutants, to be taught by mutants.
Everything I'm about to get into is unfortunately the results of what happens when you do your own research and you don't, make videos by writing AI, because I did a lot of research for what was meant to be a very tight, fun video, and it ended up being more complicated than that. So what is interesting about the X-Men is that, yes, they are an interesting allegory for a lot of different things, but they have roots in real life political figures and were written at a certain time, and their views have changed and their identities have been appropriated by many different groups, which complicates the allegory. When speaking about their conception of Magneto, both Lee and Kirby, who were Jewish, talked about him not fully being a villain. I knew villains had to come from somewhere, and they came from people. My villains were people that developed problems. He just wanted to strike back at the people who were so bigoted and racist. He was trying to defend the mutants, and because society was not treating them fairly, he was going to teach society a lesson. Chris Claremont, when evolving Magneto's backstory and his relationship with Professor X, used Menahem Menin as the blueprint for this revamped Magneto and David Ben-Gurion for Professor X. Now, I know everyone uses the Malcolm X MLK split, but I think in recent years it has become clear how that comes from a really flattened idea of both of those civil rights leaders' ideology. Menahem was the former Prime Minister of Israel and was also a major conservative right-wing Zionist leader who was responsible for helping to organize the King David Hotel bombing, an action that was condemned by David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel. And he was still a Zionist who oversaw the 1948 exodus of Palestinians. We have proof that he did want at some points to have some kind of peace with Arabs, as he put it, but he was still a tool for their displacement. If these are the figures that inspired Magneto and Professor X, what does that mean for the politics of those characters? How then do we view this allegory that is seen as so universal when it is rooted in something very specific and political? And as I was doing my research, and I realized this as someone who supports a free Palestine, I was thinking about this myself, and I think Douglas Wolk discusses this really well in his book All of the Marvels, where he talks about the X-Men as an allegory that stands for everything but also nothing. The Claremont-Brimes team's smartest innovation of X-Men was that they began to take proper advantage of the metaphor that had been built into the series all along. Mutants as the despised and oppressed other. The X-Men are feared and hated by the world they have sworn to protect. The world of Homo sapiens. That hate and fear is directed towards them as a group and binds them as a group. What either the X-Men or their enemies do is inseparable in the public eye from what mutants do. The particular genius of that metaphor is that it applies to a whole lot of people in a very general way, enough to permit readers' identification with the X-Men as a group without applying completely and directly to anyone. And its slight corollary is that mutants' oppressors are humans, a group to which every reader and creator of X-Men comics does belong. Violence against mutants is committed by us, or at least in our name. The fictional mutants' ideologies are their own, and can change over time without doing a disservice to real people's histories and evolving ideologies. Mutants are sort of every marginalized group, but they are also none of them, or at least not the ones that exist in the real world. Even if we look at the African nation of Genosha in the comics, it was created as a stand-in for South African apartheid.
Genosha's not genocide, it's time management. In 100 years, mutants outnumber humans 10 to 1, and generations later, human extinction. It's like this scary ozone stuff in the news. Act today to save tomorrow.
Rick Leonardi and Chris Claremont created it in 1988 as a place where mutants were being used for slave labor, and Cameron Hodge and the engineer turned the mutants in Genosha into brainwashed versions of themselves. When Genosha was freed, Eventually, Magneto became the ruler, but then Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely decided that they would destroy most of it in a Sentinel attack by Cassandra Nova. So while it started off as an allegory for South African apartheid, some have come to see it under Magneto's rule as being more of an Israel stand-in. And I get that. But it is not the same in development. It's never treated like an ancestral mutant homeland. There isn't really that much displacement, at least not in the stories that I've seen. And it is mostly just a setting to be able to allude to ethnic conflicts and to give Magneto something more to do on a world stage. Especially when you consider the fact that, like, if the mutants are, in this sense, the slave population, then that means that they're black. And, you know, so it's complicated to, like, take that and put it one way or another, because mutants are something that is not black or Jewish, because there are separately black mutants and Jewish mutants. So do I think what Magneto means can be separate from what he originally meant? And I think to a degree, absolutely, especially because comic books are so collaborative and he changes and evolves all the time. He don't even got 3 kids no more. Magneto is one of my favorite characters, but I think this is part of the reason why even the best stories about fantastical racism can be problematic when you have to dig deeper than just a surface story. The fact that so many people do compare Magneto and Professor X to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King just shows that what people are connecting to is a general idea of the other, that they are putting it into these characters, and what it truly means can sometimes be lost. Because let's look at how many people are like, oh my god, the X-Men are woke now.
Raven, I asked you a question.
I don't answer to my slave name.
Raven Darkholm, that's your real name, isn't it? Or has he convinced you you don't have a family anymore?
Honey, it's a cow farm. The fact that there is a desire to get into a real life ideology for these characters leads to really interesting political conversations. What happens when you structure a very American Western comic series about bigotry and discrimination and have 2 real life inspirations for the ideological divide in the narrative be 2 Zionist figures? If mutants can be any group, then does the inspiration continue to matter? I don't personally think that Magneto would be a Zionist. There are plenty of Holocaust survivors and Jewish leaders, theorists who are not. So I think the idea that because he is Jewish, he would automatically be a Zionist is sort of like a I think that's a very problematic conceit, because again, we have seen through all of the efforts going on how many Jewish leaders have been speaking about this just recently on the Emmys.
For many reasons, I feel like it is my obligation as a Jewish person to distinguish Jews from the state of Israel, because our religion and our culture is such an important and long-standing, basically like institution that is really separate to this sort of ethno-nationalist state.
And additionally, as I said before, being a mutant isn't tied to any one race, religion, land. It is an examination in difference. Please know I didn't plan for this take to happen, but that is the joy of writing your own scripts and doing your own research, is that you end up learning things and you have to deal with the consequences of new knowledge.
Previously on Defiance.
Okay, so I will fully admit that I made, in part, this video so I could talk about the show Defiance. It is a futuristic space western where Earth has been terraformed due to alien colonialists called the Voltans. As a result, in 2046, right around the corner, there are these new alien races that interact with humans and have their own complex politics about their coexistence. Alien invasion narratives are rooted in colonial anxiety. H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds is the first true alien invasion story, and it opens with, no one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own, that as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves, and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. The War of the Worlds shows Victorian England, then the seat of empire, being taken over by the technologically advanced beings from Mars. Martians treat humans in the way white colonialists treated other races of people. For Wells, this was meant to be introspective, to cast a light on humanity's own atrocities. Little did he know that the poisonous gas he had the Martians use in the story would be a precursor of things to come. Aliens are the ultimate other, literally from another world. They can look like us, they can look nothing like us, be superior or inferior to us. Regardless, they ask us to consider what is human and what lengths our own humanity can be pushed aside when we decide other creatures aren't worthy of human rights. And what does humanity look like and is perceived as threatening?
Edwards, what the hell happened?
Hesitated.
May I ask why you felt little Tiffany deserved to die?
You have quite a few stories about insect alien races like Ender's Game or Starship Troopers. Both feature stories of hive mind invading creatures, with Ender's buggers not realizing that each individual human is just that, an individual. There is so much of the horror the characters face because of miscommunication, not an insurmountable difference. You have my friend Lindsay Ellis's Axiom Zen series, which deals with aliens who have different relationships and language and gender ideas than our own, that question how much we should keep from the public about the extended universe, how it would complicate our lives and intimacies. There is a range of possibilities that come from the alien narrative. But Defiance was for me what I think Star Trek probably was for cooler people, which was the exploration of the human-alien difference. Other times when we see alien society explored, it's fairly easy to see which aliens are like the space Jewish people, the space natives, the space black people. What made Defiance unique for me was that among the cast of main characters included the Macaulay family and Native family. Raph, played by the late, great Graham Greene, is one of the founding families of Defiance, one of the richest, and is racist towards aliens. And it creates so many moments of, did they really just have a native person say that? It doesn't help that the Tar family, his rival family, are aliens who are like the whitest creatures. So you have a narrative that once again understands the language of imperialism, otherness, and puts it in the mouth of a First Nations character fighting about land rights and identity with a very white alien. Without meaning to, it presents a sort of reverse racism as something real. We just end up going in circles about what the intent of the message was, because no one can decide, is this or is this not fascist enough? Sort of like, I'm just kidding. I didn't finish watching Attack on Titan. It's too much for me, man. I'll admit it. You can call me a puss. I just can't watch that many people get eaten like that. But to go back to the conversation about demons and all these kind of things, it did remind me about a similar conversation about race in fantasy and one of the roots of race talk in fantasy.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
A few years ago, there was a conversation about orcs. Orcs, as we know them today, have been very heavily influenced by the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien and have been codified in their nature in Warcraft, Magic the Gathering, and Dungeons & Dragons, to name a few. Tolkien created the orcs as a race of monsters that could be easily disposed of in comparison to the elves. They existed to be sort of inherently evil, and that was that. In Beowulf, orcs are described as being descended from Cain. Hi, Lola. So the Mark of Cain comes from the Genesis story of Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, who both gave tributes to God, but God only favored Abel's. Cain killed Abel, making Cain the first person born, because he's the older brother, and the first murderer, and Abel's the first person to die. So I guess Adam and Eve had to deal with that. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and wandered on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Now, of course, you're probably wondering, if Adam and Eve are the original people, and they had 2 sons, you assume they probably had daughters as well. But if they're the original people, who are these other people they might come across? Anyway, the Mark of Cain is a very interesting thing because it's been interpreted in many different ways depending on which iteration. It kind of means something different in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. But one perception of it has been dark skin. Why? Because the media literacy crisis has always been a problem. Everyone kind of knows the Mark of Cain or the Curse of Ham, but everyone forgets about the time that God made Miriam ashy for being colorist. What about that part, huh? In the text of Lord of the Rings, the orcs are pretty basic as evil creatures, but the problem sort of came about with how Tolkien wrote about them in letters, where he's working on the kind of inconsistent way he conceives them. And the most problematic way this shows up is in letter 210 from a letter to Forrest J. Ackerman from June 1958, where he says, "The orcs are definitely stated to be corruptions of the human form seen in elves and men. They are, or were, squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the two Europeans' least lovely Mongol types."
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
Orcs stand in for the other, a demonized enemy that can be plowed down without a question of their humanity or alignment. The problem comes in the Victorian era language, otherizing them by a direct comparison to Mongol types with flat noses and slant eyes, especially when, we can't stop talking about how fair and pretty the elves are. In the article, "Why is the Only Good Orc a Dead Orc?" for Modern Fiction Studies, they address the calls of racism that came following the film's release that makes certain image choices that feed into the subtextual racist stereotyping that are present in Tolkien's thinking, ultimately saying that despite the stumbles of these letters and some of the language, there is no inherent intent towards racism from Tolkien. The juxtaposition between the orcs and the elves is just one of the many aspects of the text that's very European. Orcs are dark, brutish, and simple creatures. Elves are fair, educated, they got complex languages, all that shit. A counter-argument that I thought was worth examining was the question of what makes orcs different from stormtroopers in Star Wars. And I think the difference is that stormtroopers were part of the symbolic fascist Nazi aesthetic that the film was going for. I mean, the word comes from the German stormtroopers who were elite troops in World War I under Imperial Germany, so like not Nazis. But the Stormtrooper magazine was the official American Nazi Party publication from 1962 to 1968. They were intentionally designed and crafted to represent a faceless, nameless foot soldier of an empire. They are pulling from modern military history and have a political statement to make. In comparison, I don't think that the intention of Tolkien was to be racist, but I think the orcs represent the overlap of religion and folklore in terms of how good and evil become signified through light and night, fair and dark. That trickles down into how we view people and racial science and racial language, and we see that in different texts. I think it's disingenuous to ignore that. And let me just make sure you can all hear this very clearly. I don't think that Tolkien is like a secret racist. I don't. We have letters and statements of him opposing Nazis, of choosing not to be classified as an Aryan, him being against South African apartheid, the treatment of African natives in South Africa during World War II. I am personally not discussing the allegations of anti-Semitism because I want to do a deeper reading into that. But even in his letters where he discusses talking about the Jewish nature of the dwarves, he kind of comes to that realization, and it is not, at least from my reading, malicious, but that's not my statement to make. Someone else can. Overall, what I can say from what I have read and researched, I don't think Tolkien meant for it to be racist. However, he is still a man of his time who has seen imperialism from inside the imperialist nation. There are plenty of ways in which we see how language about the other can end up coming back to haunt you, because you are inherently dehumanizing a certain side. And I think we can still side-eye how he describes the orcs and pull at that string in a narrative, especially because so many people simply copy and paste those stereotypes into modern narratives without thinking them through or trying to understand where they came from. You don't have to wholesale throw out Tolkien. So often the conflict happens is that if you mention that you think it's a little suspect or dubious, people are like, oh, we're gonna just throw away Tolkien now. We're just gonna throw away Tolkien now. No, girl, like we don't have to throw away every problematic book. We can have a discussion. But if you cringe at every discussion point, then we're never going to get anywhere. And I did not mean for all things I worked on this month to overlap in sort of a racial discourse way, but for me, the conversation about fantasy and race will always be interwoven, especially when so many of the writers that we look to when we're writing in a colonial context. It doesn't make those works inherently bad. It does, however, mean we have to unpack those things from time to time, see how we consider the evolution of the genre. I don't even think we need to retire fantastical racism entirely. World building matters. You have to be a good writer and make it work. I just think we cannot simply copy and paste what others did before without really discussing why they made those choices, especially because a lot of times you're not really doing the work that they were doing. If you're going to use Welsh and Irish names, do you understand the socio-political history and reality of those peoples? Are you taking a personal politic and trying to make it universal without considering the implications of it? Who do you make the face of this fantastical racism story? And why isn't it someone who can live at multiple intersections? Why did it take till Storm or Kitty Pryde? Only then, when we're able to have a conversation and really authors are pushed to show their work and not just lazy copy and paste Tolkien or other better writers, then can a demon just be a demon? Right now I've been reading Robin Hobbs, the Farseer trilogy for the Patreon book club, and her work is brilliant. And I love how she's able to touch on so many things, so many elements, without leading into the most cliche ways in a way that feels repetitive. She is such a brilliant writer, and she is able, with the lore she's pulling from the Arthurian legends, from romances, to really build a world that feels unique, familiar, and constantly compelling. And still talking about otherness, and doing so in a really engaging way. It can be done. It can be done. But you have to, put that toe in it. Anyway, I'm going to go finish watching The Summer Hikaru Died. I think a new episode just came out, so I'm going to go do that now. Thanks for watching. See you guys very, very soon to talk about Hermione. It seems like every few months it has been shared that there has been some data breach that has put our information in jeopardy of being on the dark web. A few years ago, it happened with T-Mobile, and it was frightening as hell. Thankfully, with services like Incogni, you can remove yourself from places putting your identity at risk. Incogni tracks down and removes your personal data from online directories, people's search sites, and even commercial databases. Since I have been using Incogni, I have been getting regular updates about removing my information from these kind of sites. I've also added my parents to Incogni because our older populations, no offense mom, are at higher risk for scams. Since using Incogni, it has removed me from 623 places that had some kind of information about me, which is terrifying. We live in a dystopian society, so we can get points at Chipotle. Try Incogni for yourself and see the difference it can make. Use code PrincessWeeks at the link below to get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan at incogni.com/princessweeks. Trust me, your future self will thank you.